appreciate the opportunity to do that. I want to thank Michael Bender, Forward Sioux Falls, and AGC for making this possible, and for the distinguished guests, all of you in our audience, and our featured speakers as well today. And I know you're all anxious to not hear from me and to hear from them, and I'm anxious to hear from them as well, because they're the real experts on what's going on in our national economy. But I thought what I would do this morning is maybe just give you a snapshot of what's happening in terms of sort of the fiscal landscape and some of the things, policy initiatives that are underway in Washington, D.C. that inevitably have an impact on what happens in our economy as well. I want to put up a few slides for you. Historically in this country, we've had a sort of the saying, the old saying, a penny saved is a penny earned. In Washington, it's a penny saved and a trillion spent. But the rate at which spending is occurring in Washington, D.C. is I think, creating a lot of anxiety in the financial markets too. Now, obviously, some would argue that historically there's a pattern of fiscal stimulus being applied when you've got an economy in a downturn. But if you look at the amount of spending that's going on, not just in terms of the fiscal stimulus, but the annual appropriation bills and next year's budget, which was just passed by the Congress last week, there is this pattern of enormous amounts of spending that I don't think is going to be sustainable over a long period of time. And what that leads, next slide, if I might, here's what we're looking at in terms of the fiscal situation in the country. Now, what's important to note about this slide is if you take the accumulated debt in the first 220 years of American history, in other words, you take the presidency of George Washington through the presidency of George Bush, we've accumulated $5.8 trillion, cumulative amount of debt. We will double that in the next 5 years and triple it in 10 at the current rates that we're piling up debt. The fiscal year 2009 deficit, that's this fiscal year, the one in which we are now living. Fiscal year for the federal government starts on October 1, so we're in fiscal year 2009 right now. The deficit this year is $1.8 trillion. Now, to put that in perspective, the fiscal year 2007 deficit was $160 billion. So 1.8 versus 160 is 10 times, over 10 times the amount of the deficit just 2 years ago. And if you look at what that represents as a percentage of our gross domestic product, $1.8 trillion as a deficit is about 13.1% of our GDP. Now, historically, we've always tried to keep those deficits in the 2 to 3% range. And as I said, in 2007, $160 billion was about 1.7% of our gross domestic product. So $1.8 trillion deficit, which is 4 times the largest deficit ever recorded in American history. Now, that would be one thing if it were a one-year trend. But what we're looking at is over a long period of time, we talk about bringing deficits down, but the average deficit over the next 10 years is $929 billion. So about $1 trillion a year in deficit spending over the course of the next 10 years, average. And that's where you get, as you start piling that up, you start adding the federal debt. So at the end of the 10-year window, which is what Congress sort of uses for budgeting, we're at $17.3 trillion, which represents 82% of our gross domestic product. We've not seen that number since 1948. And so that would, this is an example of healthcare. We've got a very growing and robust healthcare economy here in Sioux Falls. We're very blessed in this country to have a healthcare system that provides the best therapies, the best cures, the best treatments anywhere in the world. And when we look at what it costs us relative to other countries around the world as a percentage of GDP, you go back, these are 2006 numbers. In 2006, the U.S. was at 15.3% of GDP spent on healthcare. This year, 2009, at 17.6%, and in another couple of years, we're going to be at about one-fifth, 20% of our economy is going to be in the form of healthcare. The reason that's important is because it drives federal spending. And if you put the next slide up, this is where you see most of the federal government's money spent. So Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security are what we call mandatory spending in the budget. If you think the federal budget is a big pie, and you divide that pie up into pieces, 2/3 of that pie right now is in the form of mandatory spending. It's spending that Congress does not We appropriate for it, but we don't control it every year. It's all based upon eligibility requirements. If you're eligible for Social Security, you get Social Security benefits. If you're eligible for Medicare, you get Medicare benefits. The part of the pie that Congress now controls, that other one-third, half of that, or a sixth of that pie, is defense, spending on the military. The other sixth is the annual amount that Congress controls through its appropriations process, the discretionary part of the federal budget. And what's also interesting about, you talked about the interest on the debt, the amount of debt that we're acquiring over the course of the next 10 years also represents $4 trillion in interest. So if you think of the federal government as having maxed out its credit card, now we're paying finance charges, $4 trillion is the amount of interest that we will pay over the next 10 years on the amount of borrowing we're doing. At the end of that 10 years, we will be spending more on interest, $800 billion a year than we currently spend on defense. So our spending on interest alone is going to exceed the amount that we spend on national security. And $4 trillion divided on a per household basis represents about $52,000 per household just in interest on the debt. That's why this slide is so important. This is what the budget that Congress just passed last year represented in terms of new taxes, about $1.5 trillion in new taxes over 10 years. That's raising the top marginal income tax rates and doing away with some of the deductions for high income earners. That represents an increase in discretionary spending of $1.4 trillion over that same time period, and an increase in mandatory spending, those programs I just talked about, of over $1 trillion. Nothing was done in the budget to address any of the long-term obligations that are driving the federal government's costs over time and the mandatory side of the budget. So there was zero achieved in terms of savings, mandatory savings in the federal budget. So I think our focus has to be how do we stimulate and get the economy growing again, and how do we get small businesses out there, provide the right incentives out there for them to create jobs. And in my view, the way not to do that, not to get the economy back on track, is to go down a path that expands government in Washington, D.C. and creates unsustainable federal deficits and federal debt that will, I think, cripple the economy in the long run, because ultimately what happens when you start piling up that amount of debt and that amount of interest, you end up at some point having either, we'll hear from our Federal Reserve Chairman in a minute, print more money, monetize the debt, which causes inflation, which means that the people who are buying the debt, in this case, a lot of it's held. I happen to believe the American economy is very strong and very resilient. I believe that the freedoms that we enjoy in this country are what build this country. I think when you allow entrepreneurs and small businesses to give them the right incentives, the economy, as history has proven, this economy is the largest economy in the world. We're about 25% of global GDP. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because we've had good economic policy for a long period of time. We've got great creativity, great innovation in our workplace, a tremendous workforce. And so I'm very optimistic that we can pull out of this. And I harken back to Ronald Reagan, who I thought always had a great way of being very optimistic, even during adverse times, about the American future and the American people, and always saw the optimism, always saw the hope, always believed in what this country could do and its greatness. And I remember the story he told when we were fighting the Cold War against the Soviet Union, about the guy in the Soviet Union that wanted to buy a car. So he goes into the Transportation Bureau to buy a car, and he tells the guy at the Transportation Bureau, I want to buy a car. The guy at the Transportation Bureau says, well, you can have your black sedan and you can pick it up 10 years from today. And the guy goes, will that be in the morning or the afternoon? And the guy at the Transportation Bureau says, well, what difference does it make? It's 10 years from now.